Hello everybody, and welcome to part 22 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review Series. Today we are continuing our Knights of the Old Republic comics journey with two 3-issue storylines just like last time. The first one, which is titled Daze of Hate, wraps up kind of the story so far with the resolution of all the events that are happening on Arcania, and the second one, which is Knights of Suffering, sees our heroes begin to engage the Mandalorians on the front lines on Taris. There's a lot going on this time around, a lot that gets wrapped up, but also a lot that begins anew, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight into it. We begin Daze of Hate with issue 19, with Admiral Karath being allowed into Arcanian space to begin negotiations with Lord Adasca concerning the giant horde of exogorths that was revealed to the powers of the galaxy at the end of the last arc. Jarael tries to defy Adasca and leave him, but she stays when he threatens to remove Camper's hands. When Karath boards the Arcanian Legacy, he brings Zane along as a prisoner, and Jarael greets him with a very passionate kiss, which is just cover for her to bring Zane up to speed on the situation. Squint, also known as Alec, joins the auction as well, representing the Jedi, whose master, the revanchist leader, was too busy fighting the Mandalorians on behalf of the Jedi, basically single-handedly, to come. Alec speaks with Roland, where it's revealed that Demigol, the mad Mandalorian scientist, was captured by the Republic, but had loaded himself up with enough nerf trank to knock out a Gundark and hadn't woken up since, so he hasn't been very helpful to the Jedi in terms of getting intel about the Mandalorians. Alec also learned what Zane had been accused of, and because he's a real one, didn't believe a word of it. Adasca finds out Alec isn't the only Jedi representative present though, and when he goes to meet a new guest, which he hopes is the true revanchist, he's greeted by Lucian Dre. Though the two actually go way back since their trust fund baby days, Adasca discombobulates him with a poisoned drink and takes his lightsaber, saying that he can't afford any uninvited guests. Adasca returns to the foyer just as his final guest arrives, Mandalore himself, much to the dismay of the other attendees. Adasca had previously convinced Roland to call Mandalore in exchange for the possibility of Jarael's freedom. Later, Lucian awakens to find himself tied up in the brig with none other than his old Padawan, Zane Carrick. Moving on to issue 20, after Adasca is forced to relieve the tensions between Mandalore and basically everybody else, Mandalore meets with Roland, where he reveals that the Mandalorians had presumed Roland dead, but turned him posthumously into a war hero. The new legend of Roland the Questioner ended when Roland accepted only one answer for his doubts: the word of Mandalore, and admitted that victory is only achieved by strictly obeying commands. Roland requests to continue to stay outside Mandalorian command, and Mandalore accepts, but requires Roland to wear a new suit of armor so that his old identity as Roland can remain dead to the Mandalorians. As Admiral Karath and Alec discuss arresting Adasca outright for his treachery, Camper manages to get a hold of Jarael through her locator bracelet and urges her to escape. Camper explains that he's discovered that the shortened lifespans and diseases that are so prevalent in Arcanian offshoots aren't natural, but have been directly caused by the schemes of Adasca and his ancestors. Speaking of the devil, Adasca overhears them and attacks Jarael, but is stopped by Alec, who warns Camper to do as Adasca tells him, or Jarael will become Adasca's next test subject. Back at the brig, Zane and Lucian finally get a chance to discuss their past without being able to kill each other. Lucian asserts that he hasn't fallen to the dark side for doing what he believes is the right thing and moving to destroy a threat, and that Jedi kill people every day for less. Lucian also informs Zane that he came to the auction because his associates have been having dangerous visions concerning the exogorths, but Zane tells him he's not exactly a big fan of their visions. When droid guards come to feed the two prisoners, the two use the Force to destroy them and get free. At his very first chance, Lucian recovers his lightsaber and takes a big swing at Zane, who protects himself with Camper's van braces. Satisfied for now, Lucian hands him a gun, saying that they'll settle up after they've dealt with Adasca. Back at the party, Adasca continues his demonstration, showing how the exogorths can easily devour asteroids, moons, perhaps even planets themselves. Alec asks him if he cares at all what happens to the people of such worlds, but all Adasca cares about is putting Arcania and his own people above the war and out of its reach. Mandalore says he doesn't actually want to use the exogorths as weapons, but just wants to keep them out of Republic hands. Admiral Karath points out that that isn't very warrior-like, and Mandalore responds that he has recently discovered that politics and intrigue are simply war by different means. Mandalore's official proposal is this: that the Mandalorian forces will serve Adasca if Adasca supplies Mandalore with more traditional weapons to continue the war. Elsewhere, deep in the Arcanian medical labs, E.G. discovers a shocking secret about Jarael's blood, but is gunned down by a shadowy Roland in his new armor, who claims that he is the only one worthy of such knowledge. Going into issue 21, Adasca revels in the amount of power soon to come to his fingertips, suggesting that along with a Mandalorian army, he could use his own personal Jedi Order as well. Zane, Lucian, and Carthonasi view the meeting from elsewhere, updating each other on the situation. When Zane tells Lucian that Adaska is using Jarail to control Camper and the Exogorths, Lucian suggests that they just kill Jarail to remove Adaska's leverage, but Roland sneaks up behind him and suggests very politely that they don't do that. Asking Roland if he can borrow his new set of armor, Zane begins to devise a plan not unlike one Griff might have made if he wasn't turned to glass on Sirocco. As Admiral Karath and Mandalore bicker amongst themselves over their proposals, Zane and Karth stage an argument in the foyer, creating a diversion that allows them to take out the security droids. After freeing Jarail, all hell breaks loose as the Jedi try to capture Mandalore. Zane sends a message to Camper letting them know that they have Jarail, and the last resort is automatically triggered to leave the Arcanian Legacy's docking bay, leaving LB behind. Aww. Camper escapes his captivity, and the giant space worms begin their assault on the Arcanian fleet, and in a rage, Adaska challenges Camper to come down and face him himself. Camper, though, still controls the Exogorths and sends them down onto the Arcanian Legacy, telling Lord Adaska that he quits. Again. As the Mandalorians retreat, Republic officers command Karth to recapture Zane, but he lets Zane go, saying that there's too many bad guys around right now, but that Zane isn't one, and he doesn't want him to become one either. LB finds Jarail and Roland as they prepare to escape with Zane, but Jarail gets a call from Camper, who sadly will not be able to join them, as he has to lead the Exogorths far, far away into wild space, where they won't bother or be bothered by anyone. Lucian reappears and allows all the others safe passage aboard his ship on the condition that Zane comes with him as prisoner. Zane is about to accept when a ship crashes in right on top of them, and out come the Mumo brothers and Slisk, who reveal not only that Griff is alive, but he sent them to rescue Zane, and also that he's now leading a resistance movement on Taris. What a turnaround. Lucian cries out that Zane can't run forever, but accepts that the chase for Zane will end where it began, on Terrace. Okay, so I'm actually going to review this arc all on its own before the next one, because it really feels like a definitive conclusion to a lot of the story that's been going on so far, and I have to say that, honestly, I really loved it. This has basically everything that I would want out of a Star Wars comic. It's got great action, betrayals, intrigue, shifting alliances, reunions, comedy, answered questions, all around like a great synthesis of basically everything that Knights of the Old Republic has been building up until this point, that's separate from the Jedi Covenant storyline. I always love when you can feel the fulfilled potential of a comic series, especially one that is just this huge exploration of its own dedicated era of this huge universe, but also kind of tackles its own self-contained story. I have to say, I really enjoy these kind of like big auction stock plots that they use sometimes in Star Wars comics, where people of conflicting factions all have to get together in a big room and not kill each other while some powerful person tries to sell off some big thing that they all want. And it always ends with the truce breaking down in spectacular fashion and nobody really getting the thing that they all wanted in the first place. Some other examples, like off the top of my head, are the Screaming Citadel arc, and I'm pretty sure the War of the Bounty Hunters, Crimson Dawn, Auction for Han kind of covers that same territory as well. I haven't actually read that yet, so I don't know how that ends. I'm pretty sure the 2017 Darth Maul miniseries, which I have read, does something similar. Anyway, it's a pretty well-worn trope, not only in Star Wars, but just in general. But I think it's just a great opportunity to see how all of these different characters tick, how they all interact, how they think, and it really lays bare what all of their true motivations are. You know, it reveals stuff like how unprepared the Republic really is to handle situations like this, how pragmatic the Jedi try to be, but all in different ways, and how the Mandalorians are prepared to adapt and protect their own interests in ways that might be surprising. I especially love that we get to see all this hashed out between some big legitimate powers that be, like the Republic, the Jedi, the Mandalorians. A lot of these times, at least in Star Wars, these big auctions are between kind of throwaway thug characters or characters that we know are mostly going to all make it out alive. So either way, we're not very invested in their fates or what's going to happen. Yeah, oftentimes, at least I'm just pulling my memory from the 2017 Darth Maul comics, there's just like a lot of interchangeable kind of scum bounty hunter characters that just... Sometimes it's just not that interesting. Even if it's a well-written story, you're not that interested in the characters per se. So for there to be a story like this with all factions and characters that we've taken the time to get invested in, even if the only character that dies is the main big villain that's getting them all together, I think that this was still a really useful story for exploring all of these characters, and just to see their leaders get into this truce and discuss all of their different ideologies and strategies, and then to have them fight, it really lets you explore like the different tenets and flaws flaws and aspects of all these groups and all these individual characters, and maybe some like unexpected but charming aspects of them, like the Mandalorians and kind of their strange sense of honor and how that can bleed into certain things. Overall, super great foundation for a fun story. It manages to cram a lot in plot-wise and reveal a lot about all of these different groups of people that it's getting involved with at the same time. It's efficient, it's effective, and it makes for a great story, and it's just a great use of a lot of elements that the comic has been slowly building up to so far. I love that we finally get to see Zane and Lucian kind of temporarily reunite and hash things out in a setting where they can't really kill each other quite yet. A big moment for me was when Lucian was claiming to be very confident that he had not been exposed to the dark side at all after killing 5 children. I know I've kind of gone into this before, but resorting to horrific deeds like killing children in order to meet your goals is kind of as much dark side as you can go, no matter what kind of dressing you put on it. If you're going to do something like killing children to meet your goals, then you're functionally a little different from the Sith. Obviously, the Sith are like their own religion with their own spiritual beliefs and artifacts and history, but like in terms of like motives and just like partially in terms of philosophy, if you're gonna go that very like what you think is a utilitarian route, that brings you very close to being a Sith. You know, many Sith become Sith by doing these horrific things before they get like fully inducted into some of the stranger things like the rituals and the customs. You know, you can totally understand where Lucian is coming from, but I think he hasn't backtracked and made that kind of mental pathway of realizing that the Jedi and the Republic are there, ostensibly at least, to like do good, and that when you do bad, it doesn't matter if the Jedi are on top if you're still gonna do bad in the name of the Jedi. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not very practical to just keep the Jedi safe by any means necessary if you're going to undermine everything that the Jedi stand for. But I still think that you can tell like where he's coming from with his actions, even if you can completely disagree with them. Honestly, I really hope that Lucian eventually finds out how wrong he is and like truly understands like the horror of what he's done, because he seems to be a very stoic character that doesn't get emotionally overwhelmed very easily. So I really want him to feel the weight of his actions one day. I don't know if I necessarily want like this big redemption arc for him. I really wouldn't be surprised if he ends up dying once he comes to the light side, if he does at all. Although I feel like they've done a whole lot with this character in terms of both the plot and in terms of pathos, and really dealing with a lot of the kind of moral quandaries that this Knights of the Old Republic series is generally going for. So I hope that they don't kill him off immediately, and maybe he will get involved in the war in some interesting new way. I don't know if Zane will ever truly forgive him for everything that he's done, but maybe they will actually come to work together in some way. At the very least, I think he'll get more of a Vader ending, where he'll get one last chance to do something selfless instead of a Palpatine ending where he just dies as bad as he always was. So Roland continues to be a very interesting character, both by himself and in conversation with the other Mandalorians, who were kind of the unexpected stars of this arc. I really like this dynamic where Roland can no longer not be true to himself, and he's even willing to admit that in front of his old master, who had made this alternate identity of him to tell stories of how Roland was actually completely the opposite and decided to become subordinate once again. You know, he has this master that he ultimately betrayed and disagrees with fundamentally, but still has an enormous amount of respect for, but that's also paired with this element that he can't not go his own way. And the cool thing is that Mandalore is actually cool with this. He's cool with Roland because, like, he already made up the story to fit his own end, so he's already gotten everything out of Roland that he needs, so he lets him go. And I love when we get these cultures and these new kind of modes of thinking that are surprising to us in the real world and surprising to maybe other characters and groups like the Jedi, who at the end of the day kind of have patterns of speaking and thinking that are pretty similar to ones that we have in real life, probably because the Jedi are the characters that we are supposed to identify with the most. But I just feel like that the Mandalorians have this established culture that I'm sure some other culture on Earth somewhere is like this and would have something like this, but I just feel like they're that much different that I feel like this is one of the rare times in Star Wars where the strangeness of the culture and the interactions really fits the strangeness of the setting, if that makes any sense. You know, I really like the Mandalorian show and what they do with Mandalorian society there. I think they have a lot of that, but like seeing them at their peak here and at a different point in history where they are a unified culture instead of just like a loose collection of splintered groups that all kind of have their own different beliefs is just so cool. And I wonder how this continuing conflict and maybe their downfall is going to kind of transition them into the state we see in, say, the Clone Wars, where they're less powerful and they're kind of self-conflicted. Although I know that the Clone Wars did kind of retcon a lot of previously established Mandalorian lore. I mean, we'll just have to cross that bridge when we get to it, though. I am already nervous about how the whole Clone Wars section is going to go, because I know there is all kinds of retcons that happens with all the lore that is in there, with like between the tie-in material that came in before and after the series started. And I haven't read any of the books by Karen Travis yet, the Republic Commando. I have definitely dabbled into some other Legends stories since starting this series, whereas at the beginning of this series, I definitely was very new to Legends and hadn't read basically anything. But now I've started to dabble in some things, especially post Return of the Jedi. But I have not read any Legends literature around the Clone Wars era. So basically that's a long roundabout way of saying I haven't read Karen Travis's Republic Commando books where a lot of that Mandalorian culture might have been established. I can't remember when exactly those books came out, so I wonder how much conversation there was between these comics and the kind of really heavy in-depth elements of Mandalorian lore that are explored in there. So we might just have to get to that in like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years when I finally get to those books. Anyway, Roland is a great character. I can't wait to see everything that he continues to get up with Zane and the gang. I think they make such an interesting motley crew with like a rogue Mandalorian on board. I think this is one of the more interesting stories Star Wars has came up with, of someone breaking away from their culture and finding their own path and their own identity, while still having to reckon with and be in conflict with and still kind of be somewhat in synergy with that culture that they came from previously. And I'm just kind of realizing now that that's what Knights of the Old Republic, this comic series, is about. And an extent, we have Camper and Jarael having to deal with their previous identities in Arcanian society. We have Zane trying to forge his own identity as like a rogue Jedi, where so much of his identity is kind of forged by the positive elements of his past, but also how his beloved order has completely wrecked him. I'd say in comparison, while I do really like the Mandalorian show, I was disappointed with kind of the wishy-washy direction they went in Season 3 with a character who was tempted to leave the really strict rules of his culture, and then they kind of just decide to go back to it without much effort or internal conflict. Like, he takes the mask off, and then he puts the mask back on because of his religious convictions. And that's that's it. Like, they had this whole thing where they were building up where he wanted to take his mask off at different points, and then he just keeps it on for the rest of the time. We need Pedro Pascal back so we can have the mask off again. I'm sorry. All that being said, moving on from the Mandalorians, I really hope that Jarael gets to be more active soon now that she's freed from the Arcanians and she's free from Adasca. These past few arcs have had a lot of moving parts, but I'm not a huge fan of how she's kind of been reduced to a MacGuffin or a damsel in distress to be kind of pinballed around by all these other characters and used as a bargaining chip, especially considering how she was characterized in the first couple arcs as being a really, dare I say, strong and independent female character. I don't know, she just used to be really snarky and protective of herself and Camper, and I know she doesn't really have any special abilities like armor or political clout or lightsabers or force powers. I don't know, it feels like for this whole Arcania story, she's just been waiting around to kind of cry and be sad or to be saved by someone. I do like that she got a staff to fight alongside everyone else at the end, though, and here's hoping that once they touch down on Taris, Zane can start to teach her maybe some Jedi moves or something. I'm still not too sure what's up with the relationship between Roland and Jarael and why Roland is so hell-bent on protecting her. He might just be in love with her, but based on the way that he interacts with her, and he's kind of cold and standoffish to everybody, I don't think it's like that. I think it's probably because he knows the secret of her blood, but even then, the way that he's like, he would give up his life for her, I'm pretty sure, something's not adding up here for me, and I'm assuming they're treating it with so much importance that it'll get resolved, but they keep kind of dragging on these story points. I don't know, I just liked Jarael back when she was important for her own character qualities, instead of just some undefined genetic thing that feels like it's been imposed on her instead of like an actual personality trait that pushes her into the story. So moving on to the Jedi characters, although the Jedi other than the Covenant are still made out to be the good guys generally, I am really curious to see what the Revanchists are up to and what we'll get to see of them in the future, and how their breaking of Jedi guidelines and involvement in the war will be played off by the writers and treated by the characters in the story. Each era of Star Wars generally has something pretty specific to say about the virtues of the Jedi ideology in general, but also how they can be flawed as an institution, and I'm curious to see how the narrative will judge these different Jedi groups who are basically all straying from the general orthodoxy of the Jedi Order in one way or another. We know that Alec and his master eventually become Darth Malak and Darth Revan. That's hardly a spoiler, but I also still have no idea how that's going to happen. And we're approaching the halfway point of these comics, which are the prelude to that story, even though, you know, most of the story is about Zane and his friends and his past, but I'm very much ready to see how it'll all fall into place in time for the video games. So in terms of Adascorp, who is the big villain for this story, his death was perfect. I definitely enjoy it when these kind of stock, manipulative antagonists with grand plans get a death that feels like they brought down on themselves. Very classic, very Star Wars. I don't really have any notes on that. Other than Adascorp, I guess Camper is the only character to reach some kind of real conclusion in this arc. He doesn't really serve the same purpose in the story that, say, Zane does, where it's like the point of his character is to be this protagonist that grows and changes, but seeing his story end by absolving himself of his past sins and his past way of life, by fixing kind of a mistake he made that even if it wasn't really a mistake on his part, just breaking free of his old boss's grip and using his own expertise to save the day, it was a very nice full circle moment for him. And it's funny to think that he may be indirectly responsible for a certain detour in Han and Leia's journey thousands of years later in The Empire Strikes Back. I have a feeling we'll see him again, but if we don't, I think this was a satisfying place for his character to be left off, especially if it gives Jarail a little more freedom to move around as a character. As for Griff, you know, I knew he wasn't dead, but to have him come in as sort of like a quick Deus Ex Machina was honestly, it was pretty fun. Him evolving from Taris lowlife to Taris freedom fighter wasn't something I expected necessarily, but I think it makes perfect sense, and I'm satisfied to see his character possibly going in a new direction, though surely he's finding some kind of way to still scam people. I don't think he's completely changed. As for the art, we have a new penciler named Bong Dezo. I thought it was someone else returning, like Dustin Weaver, for the art, because it looked pretty similar to some art we've seen in here previously. But this is a new artist, and you can really see it in, like, the faces for the characters, for example. I don't feel super strongly about his art. Some of the facial expressions look a bit off, and I feel like the other artists have represented some of the characters in ways that have just stuck in my head at this point. But overall, Dezo's work and his attention to detail is definitely serviceable, and we still have the same colorist that we've had the whole time with Michael Atiyeh. So the colors all continue to really pop in ways that I really love, and I think that contributes a whole lot to this series having more or less a consistent visual style. Honestly, I feel like the colors more than anything in this series have like a really strong sense of unity and visual cohesion and vibrance, even if we have a very revolving roster of pencilers. The covers for these three issues, I have to say, are stellar. I love the artwork paired with like the classic comic cover dialogue of characters in absurd situations, which are rarely ever closely indicative of something that's actually happening in the comic themselves. But I really like these first two covers done by Colin Wilson. The cell shaded light especially is just great. Alright, so I think I've said everything that I want to say about Daze of Hate. Great little mid-season conclusion to everything this series is built up to so far. It's not perfect, but most of its flaws in my eyes were either borrowed from earlier in the story or got resolved here in some way anyway. So I'm going to give this a very nice 4.5 out of 5 giant space worms. With that one out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to Knights of Suffering. We begin issue 22 with Roland sneaking the crew onto the surface of Terrace, which is controlled by the Mandalorian warlord Cassius Fett. Zane, in Roland's spare set of Neo Crusader armor, jetpacks down to the surface where he finally reunites with Griff and meets his resistance cell, really just a swoop biker gang called the Hidden Becks. Griff messages their allies on Coruscant that they've secured Zane with a handy-dandy briefcase whose comms can bypass the Mandalorian jamming. After the Becks escape from a Mandalorian attack, Zane finds out from one of the leaders named Gaiden that Zane was called to the planet to be used as a bargaining chip to get the Becks in the door with the main resistance, considering Zane is basically blamed for the Jedi and Republic abandoning Taris. We also find out that the Becks have met some pushback from the planet's constable, who refuses to work with the Becks as she believes they've kidnapped her children. Once they get a chance to really catch up, Griff tells Zane that the story of how he got off Sirocco was a good question for another time. Griff also tells Zane that essentially the reason he's even fighting there on Terrace is because he's working for Jervo Thalion, the head of the Taresian company called Lojan Industries. The entire reason Terrace was even in the Republic in the first place is because Jervo is friends with the planet's senator named Goravis, who essentially became a senator by helping Jervo establish his business. Now, Griff has a deal with Jervo that if he finds Goravis, he'll have most of the bounties and charges against both himself and Zane on Terrace dropped. Next we meet two Twi'leks, Griff Vow, who's spelled differently from the other Griff, and his little sister Mission, who takes Zane to see something, presumably some kind of pet, that her brother keeps visiting underground. However, they discover that this hidden thing that's being kept underground is in fact the Constable's children, which makes the leader of the Becks quite upset. Zane, Griff, and the Becks fight their way through some Mandalorians to meet up with the other Resistance cell and return the children of the Constable. Once there, Zane reunites with an old friend, Shell, the sister of his old Padawan friend Shad, and an old crush of his. But Shell pulls a gun on him, and though Griff's magic briefcase takes the brunt of the stun shot, Master Rana Tay appears and tells her to finish him, because as Zane probably should have guessed, Shell believes that Zane killed her brother. Onto issue 23, Cassius Fett oversees the conquest of Taris. Supposedly he was brought in to help direct the Mandalorian forces, as they are a nomad culture with no real set systems in place for anything. Organized conquest has proven pretty challenging in terms of logistics. Regardless, Fett enjoys insulting the incompetence of his pathetic underlings. Back at the underground resistance base, the Hidden Becks, the Jedi, and the Constable's resistance find themselves in a three-way standoff over what the hell to do with Zane. Since, at the end of the day, Zane is the one who found and returned the Constable's kids, the Becks are able to keep everybody from killing him for now. Griff goes over his assignment with Senator Goravis, who by all accounts seems to be a decent senator who doesn't give up on his people, even if his bid for senator was originally supported by companies he had basically bribed. Jervo joins the conversation over hologram from Griff's magic briefcase and reveals that he wanted Goravis found, not to save him, but to have him silenced before he could reveal those bribes. But Master Rana Tay intervenes and more resistance and fighting ensues. Goravis proposes a new deal with Jervo to get more magic Mando-circumventing briefcases in order to forget about their little feud. Back at the stronghold, Shell tells Zane that she's only on Taris because she was trying to put a bounty on his head. Zane points out that her bounty was paid for with money wired to her family by Zane's dad at Zane's behest. Unfortunately, no one ever really believes Zane about anything, least of all when he tries to tell someone for the umpteenth time that he did not murder the other Padawans. At this point, we should start a drinking game every time Zane runs into someone who still thinks he did that. Master Tay comes in to try and further convince Shell that Zane's mind is deluded by the dark side. Tay says she couldn't have killed Shell's brother, and Zane says of course not, because she wasn't standing close enough to him. Goravis intervenes, suggesting that they all take their anger out on Cassius Fett instead, who they've managed to locate at the old Jedi Temple, hoping to take him out with a bomb from, you guessed it, Griff's magic briefcase. As they plan their assault, Zane proposes a recon expedition to make sure Fett is actually in the Jedi Temple and that there aren't any prisoners in there that might accidentally get blown up. Shell and Master Tay volunteer to go as well, saying that even if Zane hasn't fallen to the dark side, he's still incompetent. Master Tay conspires with Shell to kill Zane during the mission, telling Shell that if she fails, that Shell will be the one to take out Zane, with her brother's old lightsaber for some poetic justice to boot. Elsewhere in Terrace's orbit, Jarael, Roland, and Alec wait for the right time to come down and help the Resistance, but in the meantime, Roland suggests some good old-fashioned melee sparring to help clear her mind Mandalorian style. Roland and Alec recognize her warrior skill, but sparring does little to distract her from her worries about Camper. Alec brings her in close, bringing up kind of out of nowhere that though many Jedi refrain from emotional and physical connections, there have long been those who argued for it, and he asserts their arguments are pretty practical, as the children of Jedi are quite strong with the Force. He comes off a little too strong for her though, and after the whole Arcania fiasco, Jarael isn't exactly ready to start anything new, which totally understandable. Going into issue 24, we get a flashback to the Dre family estate on Coruscant 25 years in the past. we see Hazen quite ominously overseeing Lucian's mother reciting a vision, and a young Rana Tay eavesdrops in horror. Lucian's mother recites that, in the time of tribulation there will be 5, one for darkness, one for light, one from darkness that stands in the light, one from the light that stands in darkness, one last one that stands apart from them all, and between them all that has been built will fall in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Sorry, got carried away there. In the present, the rebellion's plan is underway. Zane and Shell make their way to the Jedi Tower disguised as a Mandalorian and his prisoner. Zane is still trying to convince Shell that again, for the last time, he did not kill the other Padawans, especially not her brother Shad, who's his best bud. Zane also brings up his old feelings for her, saying that thinking about a potential future with her made him feel better about probably flunking out of Jedi school. Their argument though is interrupted by some Mandalorians, but Shell kisses Zane to make them think that he's just going around recruiting, after which she hits him in the place that not even Mandalorian armor can fully protect. They sneak into the temple and make their way to a Jedi storage room where Zane mournfully recollects on playing hide and seek with Shad before going off on his own for some more recon. As he leaves, Master Tay encourages Shell to kill Zane as soon as she gets the chance. Zane reaches the temple's apex and talks with a Mandalorian soldier, who lets Zane know that Cassus Fett, in true nomad Mandalorian fashion, has moved his HQ and has also managed to find the Resistance base. Master Tay appears suddenly and cuts the soldier down in a rage, claiming that she can sense the presence of the Sith, and that she'll put an end to the one who started it all. As Zane and Master Tay begin to duel and chaos unfolds on the surface of Taris, Griff decides to go up and help Zane since his comms have gone dark. Tay manages to disarm Zane by destroying his jetpack and starts to monologue about how Zane was the subject of dreams and visions before he was even born. Zane tells her that the 5 people destined to destroy the Republic in the prophecy easily could have been referring to the 5 Masters instead of the 5 Padawans, but she's hearing none of it. As she swings for the killing blow, Shell appears and stabs Master Tay in the back with her brother's old lightsaber, tearfully admitting to Zane that she knows he didn't kill her brother. Griff arrives to rescue Shell and Zane from the top of the tower, and Master Tay stumbles forward after them. Zane extends his hand to her, offering to save her even after everything. Master Tay gets stuck in the rubble though, and when she ignites her lightsaber to cut herself free, Griff thinks that she's about to attack Zane and detonates the charges at the base of the temple. Before she descends into the wreckage, Master Tay implores Zane to tell somebody named Krinda that she's sorry. Through the Force, Masters Lucian and Kanilia sense Master Tay's death and that Zane knows about this Krinda. As he escapes, Zane reflects on this spicy new clue to the Jedi mystery. Alright, so in terms of Knights of Suffering, this is another super solid arc, and it really feels like a fresh new start for the series. Right off the bat, I do want to point out another tie-in to the KOTOR game that we find in this comic series. Of course, we're going back to Taris, which is where the game basically starts, and with that this time comes the Hidden Becks, which is a group that you can choose to team up with at some point in the game. I've only played a few hours of my own personal playthrough of the game, which isn't the one I'm going to be using for my eventual video on, but it is really nice to begin to see these elements pop up in the things I'm reading, and I'm really excited to start getting better at spotting those connections as I read more and more Legends material. I'm sure there's plenty of little things I've already missed already, like name drops of planets or species that have already appeared in media, such as books that came out before these comics did. You know, I'm sure there's plenty of little things I've missed, like the name drops of planets or species that came out in books or comics that came out before this series did. I think that the overall conflict on Terrace is great. Honestly, it's fun that we get to see Terrace fall to pieces even more than what it was at the end of Commencement. It just makes for such a good, chaotic setting for this Underground Resistance arc, and it gets us closer to how it is in the KOTOR game. Overall, the action scenes and the intrigue in this mini arc were well done. We also get some classic suit disguises and plans gone wrong, some very Star Wars-y tropes, but overall, while I think the plot itself was decent, I mostly felt drawn to the story in terms of the character work that was done. There's a lot of new factions and rivalries and infighting introduced in a pretty short amount of time, and it was a little difficult for me to wrap my head around all of it, but we do have Griff and Zane back together for some pretty classic antics, so it's hard to be too bored at any point in this arc. Speaking of Griff, like where I've said I'd hoped his character would go previously, it is very nice to see him evolving into a somewhat more noble role without sacrificing everything that made his character so likable and, dare I say, morally gray in the first place. We don't get much of an explanation for how he got off Sirocco safely, and his motivation for being with the Terrace Resistance really isn't all that altruistic at all, and it makes sense that it wouldn't be, but I am still hoping at some point we can see Griff evolve into a little bit more of like a caring or altruistic character. I think he is really growing kind of subtly in the way that he treats Zane, and I do think he really cares for Zane, but I think that's mostly stuff that shows underneath the surface, and I don't really anticipate Griff having to make some kind of like big emotional sacrifice for Zane. I don't know if we're ever going to get like a big singular emotional moment where he really turns something around. I think Griff is just the way that he is, but I think that the way that he feels about Zane is very much there underneath the surface, and I think I'm okay with that. I do hope we eventually do get an interesting explanation for how he got off Sirocco, but something tells me that they're just going to sweep that under the rug as long as they can, and I wonder if there will be some sort of hidden element that will become relevant later in the story that has something to do with how he got off, like a new character or some kind of new device or trick or strategy he came up with, but I think at this point I guess it's fine that it's not really coming up. Moving on to Zane, I do like that now that his character is more of a focus again and he's returned to the state of like constantly being in danger from people that are coming back from his past. I think that's when they do the most interesting stuff with Zane and ultimately the most interesting stuff with this comic. And seeing how all of these elements from Zane's past start coming in and affecting the Taris conflict at large was very fun. The sister of one of his old Jedi friends is a great character to throw into a mix. That's a great dynamic to have there. It's cool to see Shell, who I'm not even sure I mentioned in my video about commencement because she was only in like 2 panels, for an element that appeared so briefly so early on in the story. It really goes to show how well they planned out some of these, how well they seeded some of these early plot elements, and how well John Jackson Miller kind of does that in order to have things pay off. It really does make a lot of sense that there would be this ever-growing list of characters that Zane would constantly have to contend with, and given the way that the Jedi in this era treat their families and have more access to their families, it makes sense that the family of one of the Jedi would come in and have a strong opinion about Zane. Almost even better, I think, is to finally see Zane interacting with one of the Covenant Masters other than Lucian and eventually kind of break through to her, especially one that had such like a personal vendetta against him because he was causing so many painful nightmares for her. I think that Zane's biggest strength as a character is holding to his own Jedi ideals like mercy and compassion no matter what, and seeing that he was willing to save Master Tay's life once she admitted that she was wrong was excellent, and it's really in touch with how I think George Lucas always characterized goodness in Star Wars, that true strength doesn't come from how well you can kill your enemies, but how you can resolve things without killing. But of course, we're gonna have Griff come in like a Han Solo character who isn't attached to the Force or the morality in anything to kind of do the violent killing to save Zane anyway. As for where this Jedi Covenant story is going to move in the future, I think, or I at least hope, we are going to get to see this trend of Zane confronting and either defeating or converting each of the other masters one by one, with Lucian acting as sort of kind of the final boss, and each member that Zane takes down will get him one step closer to clearing his name. Feels like a pretty obvious general outline for how things are going to go, considering the precedent that is set here, with one arc focusing on one Covenant member and their specific personality and anxiety surrounding Zane, that each might pose interesting individual challenges for him to face. Ultimately, I think Zane is going to end up reconciling with at least some of the other ones, but just as many he'll probably have to find a way to defeat or subdue them in battle, or they'll have some kind of classic death by their own hand in a roundabout way. I guess we'll just see how well that little prediction holds up in the future. I wasn't really sure what the naming convention of these past 4 arcs was about. Obviously, they're a play on Yoda's little spiel in The Phantom Menace about fear leading to anger and then hate and then suffering, but I don't really think any of those things are really indicative of what happens here plot-wise, especially considering we got 3 arcs on Arcania and then a mostly new and unrelated story on Terrace. I guess the Knights of Suffering could be referring to Master Tay and how she kind of suffered by allowing her fear and anger and hate to influence her actions. Overall, for the plot and the characters in this arc, I am just really happy that we are beginning to see Zane begin to really break through to some of the characters in his past, and that his goodness and sticking to his ideals is really beginning to allow other people to kind of really understand that he is innocent. And I think Shell was a really great way for Zane to kind of bounce off of another character that kind of doesn't know him that well, but also gets a chance to learn more about him in a way, in like an organic way that isn't as clouded eventually by the lies of the Jedi Covenant. Ultimately, a pretty good Star Wars adventure all around that establishes a new status quo for the story by putting us back up against this Covenant and putting Zane at the focus again. Overall, I'm quite happy with the various kinds of adventures this series is taking us through and the momentum that we are slowly starting to see build towards a climax or a resolution for Zane, as I think we're starting to see a real beginning for Zane's march to fully resolve his past. As for the art, we do get Bong Dazo back, and the way he does faces and especially background details is really starting to grow on me. Like I said earlier, his style overall seems pretty similar to Dustin Weaver, who did the Flashpoint arc, so it feels like some parts of the series at least have a bit more of a consistent feel to them, but really whether it's Dazo or Weaver or Ching doing the penciling, I really enjoy basically all the art that's come out of this series. Overall, a pretty thrilling story, a very solid story in and of itself with some great Jedi and Mandalorian elements enhanced by some of Griff's signature shenanigans. All that being said, I think that this one gets a solid 4 out of 5 Mandalorian Neo Crusaders. So although we are done with Days of Hate and Nights of Suffering, just like in the last video, we have some more of those supplemental news organ articles. Once again, these are just like fun little detours that add to some of the world building of the series that are really not essential at all, though they do provide some small helpful insights on like the state of the galaxy as a whole, like how certain characters we've been following are perceived by the general public or certain other smaller groups, and perhaps some hints on the next moves of the Mandalorians, the Republic, and the Jedi. Just like last time, I am going to point you all in the direction of Revanchist's channel, who has done some wonderful voiceover narrations for all of these, and is probably one of the easiest and most accessible ways to find these little excerpts online just to read. So without further ado, let's go ahead and cover them. The elegantly titled Adascorp Fiscal Period Financial Report and Outlook, Field Report, Project Black Forest is actually one I mistakenly covered in the last video instead of this one. Apologies for getting them a bit out of order, but this is essentially just a transcript of a conversation between Adaska's grandfather Argalo and Gorman Van Drake, aka Camper, who warns Adascorp about the dangers of the Exogorths while Adascorp is simply excited to use them for their greedy purposes. The one I should have covered last time is Adascorp Fiscal Period Financial Report and Outlook, Message from the Chief Executive, which details how despite the ongoing Mandalorian War, Adascorp is very happy to report that they met or exceeded all financial targets in the recent period. Their medical and military research divisions especially saw increased activity and profits. Their mining sector was threatened by recent conflicts on Taris and Vanquo, but their droid-operated mines show great promise. The report ends with Lord Adaska's announcement that he will be adding 17 billion shares to the Adaska family's interest in order to protect investors against the current instability. So again, another fun piece showcasing the thinly veiled greed of Adaska. Very happy he got turned into Exogorth Poodoo. In the Adjudicator Special Report, Tools of the Trade, we get bounty listings again for Griff and the Corellian Strangler, who seems to now be identified, but Zane is omitted as it's speculated that he might have gone down with the Republic ship Courageous. The main article by editor Krav Novlis is about how HK-24 droids, the same kind that went after Camper and Jarail, all recently had swarmed the Inner Rim all on the same assignment, then abruptly abandoned the bounty. The author suggests that this was because they were all owned by the same owner, which we know to be Adascorp. The Terrace Holofeed Special Proclamation is an ominous one. After the apparent grim fate of Terrace's Holofeed team during the last transmission, Cassius Fett has taken over the frequency, letting Terrace know that he has released them from their allegiance to the Republic and offers the people of Terrace to share in all of Mandalore's future glorious victories. Those who choose to fight will be given armor, those who choose to serve the clans shall live in peace, but those who oppose them will get a good old-fashioned Mandalorian honorless death. Cassius Fett then deactivates the Holofeed after declaring it a medium of the Old Order. The Admiral's list, Karath Home Safely, celebrates the safe return home of Admiral Karath after the Sirocco, Vanquo, and Arcania campaigns. Though Karath tried to resign his commission after the immense loss of life under his command at Sirocco, he was instead commended for his bravery by the Republic. The Republic also released its official stance on Adaska's death, praising the late capitalist as a loyal provider for the Republic who died as he lived, searching for knowledge. The Adjudicator Special Report, The Colonies, maintains the bounty for Griff, puts up new ones for Zane and Slisk, and updates the picture of who is ostensibly the Corellian Strangler. Krav Noblis's article this time is a rumination on the chaos caused by Adascorp's new public bounty of 100 credits for each confirmed Mandalorian kill. The thing is though, Mandalorians are pretty hard to kill, definitely worth more than 100 credits, but that hasn't stopped low-level hunters from flooding redemption stations with bootleg Mandalorian helmets to try and get a piece of the pie. Griff's bounty, on the other hand, has soared to 124,000 credits and has changed from dead or alive to just dead at the behest of Lozan Industries. Finally, in the Galactic Republic Defense Ministry Daily Brief, number KD0092, we get a top-secret briefing addressed to the Defense Minister and Defense Ministry Director for Public Information of the Republic. Updates include the Mandalorians' massive ground operations on Taris, as well as an engagement on Mercure that yielded a Neo-Crusader armor specimen that is currently being studied. Other reports include the failure to recover the Arcadian Legacy ship, the loss of Republic military interest on Taris, and the Jedi's restatement on their non-interference in the war. The liaison recommends that while the Republic should publicly voice an understanding of the Jedi's decision, they may want to cooperate with the Revanchists, but not quite yet so as not to jeopardize relations with the Jedi Order as a whole. And that marks the end of Part 22 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Next time we are going to cover Volume 5 of the series titled Vector. A bit of a shorter one than we're used to, but it is unusual as it will technically be our first comic crossover, crossing between this series and 3 other series of Star Wars comics. What exactly that means, we'll just have to discover next time. So I hope you all continue to stick around with me here on this comics journey and the lead up to the Knights of the Old Republic game. And in the meantime, may the Force be with you always.